Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I had spent my whole life cleaning up my younger brother's messes, watching as he stumbled from one disaster to the next, leaving behind a trail of debts, broken promises, and misplaced trust that I was always expected to mend. But that night at dinner, something inside me snapped, a long-buried frustration clawing its way to the surface with a force I could no longer suppress. My mother's whisper cut through the air like a blade, sharp and cold, freezing me in place before I could even fully register what she had just said. The dining room was bathed in warm, artificial light, the chandelier casting elongated shadows against the dark wood of the table. But despite the cozy setting, an unmistakable tension settled between us like an invisible fog. My father, seated at the head, cleared his throat and set his fork down with a deliberate slowness that only made my pulse quicken. My mother, avoiding my gaze, idly pushed food around her plate, her shoulders hunched forward as if bracing for an argument she had already lost. Ethan, on the other hand, slouched comfortably in his chair, his usual smugness barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of false humility. His unruly brown hair fell into his eyes, and the faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as if he already knew how this conversation would unfold. He always knew. He had spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation, twisting our parents around his finger with an ease that never failed to both amaze and enrage me. "We need to talk about your brother," my father said, his voice the same calm, measured tone he had always used whenever he was about to ask for something unreasonable. I set my glass down harder than necessary, the sound ringing through the room. "What about him?" I asked, though I already knew where this was going. It always led back to the same place, the same request, the same expectation. My mother finally looked up, her expression pleading. "He's in trouble again, Olivia. He needs our help." I let out a short, humorless laugh, my fingers tightening around the napkin in my lap. "And by our help, you mean my help. Because that's how it always works, doesn't it?" "Liv," my father sighed, already tired of my resistance, already preparing the same tired arguments. "No," I cut in, my patience unraveling thread by thread. "Not this time. I have given and given and given, and what has he done in return? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He spends his life making reckless choices, knowing you'll always clean up after him, and I'm done being part of that cycle." Ethan made a show of sighing heavily, rubbing his temples as if he were the true victim in all of this. "Jesus, Olivia. Do you ever get tired of being so self-righteous? I've had a rough time, okay? Life isn't as easy for everyone as it is for you." Something inside me cracked, and before I could stop myself, the words came tumbling out, raw and unchecked. "Why do I always have to fix his messes?" A heavy silence fell over the table, the weight of my words pressing down on us like a suffocating force. My father shifted uncomfortably, my mother's fingers curled into the edge of the tablecloth, but it was her expression, one of hesitation, of barely concealed guilt, that sent a chill crawling up my spine. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her lap, as if whatever she was about to say was something she had been carrying for years, something too heavy to meet my eyes with. And then, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Because he's not who you think he is." The room around me seemed to shrink, the air thinning as my brain scrambled to process the meaning behind those words. A slow, uneasy dread slithered through my veins, because if Ethan wasn't who I thought he was, then who was he? My mother's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, and my father, the man who had always commanded every room he walked into, suddenly seemed smaller, older. As if the weight of whatever they had been hiding all these years had finally started to crush him. I turned to Ethan, searching his face for some sort of clue, some flicker of recognition, but he only stared back at me with a look I couldn't quite place, one that made my stomach twist painfully. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't shock. It was something else entirely. "You're lying," I said, though the words felt hollow even as they left my lips. My mother swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I wish I were." The floor beneath me no longer felt steady, the certainty I had carried my whole life slipping away like sand between my fingers. My brother, the boy I had spent my entire existence cleaning up after, the person I had resented for as long as I could remember, was not who I thought he was. And whatever that meant, whatever dark secret had been buried beneath years of deception, I knew one thing for certain. I was going to find out the truth. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, the weight of my mother's words pressing down on my chest like a boulder I couldn't move. My mind raced, grasping at explanations that might make sense of what I had just heard, but each possibility I considered only left me more unsettled. My parents had always protected Ethan, always treated him like something fragile, something breakable, and now, for the first time, I had to wonder if that protectiveness had nothing to do with love and everything to do with something far more sinister. I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, the noise jolting my mother's gaze up to meet mine, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. My father, ever the silent enforcer, simply stared at his plate, his fingers curled tightly around his glass as if gripping it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Ethan, for all his usual smugness, had gone eerily still, his expression unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line as if he was waiting to see what I would do next. "What the hell does that mean?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I had intended, the knot in my stomach tightening with every passing second. "He's not who I think he is? What am I supposed to take from that?" My mother swallowed hard, glancing toward my father as though waiting for him to speak, but when he remained silent, she turned back to me with an expression that made my skin crawl. "Olivia, please, just let it go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I felt my frustration snap into something colder, something dangerously close to rage. "Let it go?" I repeated, my laugh bitter and humorless. "You just told me that my own brother isn't who I think he is, and you expect me to just drop it? Are you even listening to yourself?" She flinched as though I had struck her, her fingers twisting together in her lap, but I couldn't bring myself to care. All I could think about were the years of unspoken tensions, the times I had felt like an outsider in my own family, the way Ethan had always been treated like he was special, like he was something different, something sacred. And now, suddenly, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known existed. I thought back to childhood, to the small moments I had ignored or brushed aside, moments that now took on an entirely different meaning. Ethan had always been their priority, always the one who got a second chance, a third, a fourth, while I was expected to hold everything together, to be the responsible one, the problem solver, the fixer. I had resented it for so long, had hated the way they never seemed to hold him accountable for anything, but now, for the first time, I wondered if their favoritism had nothing to do with love and everything to do with guilt. I remembered the time I had overheard a family friend telling my mother, "It's amazing what you and your husband did for him." At the time, I had assumed they meant raising him, supporting him, doing what parents were supposed to do, but now the words echoed in my mind with a different weight, a different implication. I thought about how Ethan had always had an irrational fear of hospitals, how even the mention of a routine checkup would send him into a panic, his hands shaking, his breathing shallow. I had teased him about it when we were kids, had called him dramatic, but now I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it, something deeper, something darker. And then there was my father, always the stern, controlled presence, who had once told me, "Some things are better left in the past." I had been too young to question it at the time, had assumed he was talking about something trivial, something that didn't concern me, but now, standing in this dining room with the truth just barely out of reach, I realized he had been warning me all along. I turned back to my mother, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Tell me the truth," I said, watching as she flinched again. "Tell me what you're hiding, because I swear to God, if you lie to me, I will find out on my own." Her lips parted, but no sound came out, her throat bobbing as she swallowed, and something inside me twisted at the sight. She was scared. Not just of my reaction, but of something bigger, something buried so deep that even now, she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Ethan shifted beside me, the chair creaking beneath his weight, and when I turned to look at him, I found him already staring at me, his face unreadable, his fingers drumming against the table as though he was thinking, calculating. For the first time in my life, I realized I had no idea what he was thinking. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head, the last remnants of my patience slipping away. "Fine," I said, grabbing my coat from the back of my chair. "You want to tell me? I'll figure it out myself." "Olivia, don't," my mother pleaded, but I was already walking away, my pulse pounding in my ears, my thoughts moving too fast for me to keep up with. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to stop until I knew the truth. And if they wouldn't tell me willingly, I'd find another way. By the time I reached my car, my hands were already shaking as I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. A private investigator. If my family had secrets, I was going to uncover them. The waiting was the worst part, the slow, agonizing drip of time stretching longer than I thought possible, each second heavy with the weight of a truth I was both desperate to uncover and terrified to face. The private investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Julia Meyer, had been efficient, professional, and alarmingly quick at pulling apart the flimsy paper trail that made up my brother's so-called existence. In less than a week, she had unearthed discrepancies so glaring that I couldn't believe I had never noticed them before, but then again, I had never thought to look. I had always trusted my parents, believed the narrative they had spun around our family, never questioned that Ethan was exactly who they said he was. Now, staring at the stack of documents in front of me, I realized how blind I had been, how carefully they had constructed a reality built on half-truths and omissions so large they might as well have been outright lies. "His birth certificate is a fraud," Julia said, her voice as steady as if she were reading me the weather forecast, her fingers tapping against the edge of the paper she had just slid across the table toward me. "The hospital listed doesn't have any record of his birth, and I checked. No deliveries were recorded there within 3 weeks of the date on this certificate." My hands felt cold as I reached for the document, my eyes scanning over the words that should have been familiar, should have meant something, but now felt like an elaborate fiction. My mother's name was there, my father's too, but the stamp from the hospital was missing, the signature from a doctor I had never heard of scrawled at the bottom in shaky, uneven writing. I swallowed, my throat dry. "You're saying he wasn't born here?" Julia tilted her head, considering me carefully. "I'm saying there's no record of him being born anywhere under that name on that date, in any hospital in the state." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I forced myself to stay calm, forced my voice to remain steady even as my pulse roared in my ears. "What about his social security number?" Julia slid another paper toward me, this one thinner, flimsier, more official. "Issued 5 years after his supposed birth date," she said, tapping at the highlighted section. "That's not normal. A newborn typically has a number assigned within weeks of birth. 5 years is an enormous gap, and unless your parents chose not to register him for some inexplicable reason, there's only one explanation." My mind supplied the answer before she could say it out loud, but hearing it from her lips still sent a shiver crawling down my spine. "He was someone else before that," she said simply, her gaze unreadable, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "Whoever he was before those 5 years, that identity is gone." I felt sick, my stomach twisting, my fingers tightening around the edge of the table as if anchoring myself to something tangible could stop the room from spinning around me. I had spent my entire life thinking Ethan was my brother, thinking he was the reckless, irresponsible, selfish man I had been forced to clean up after time and time again. Now, I was being told that even his name, his birth, his entire existence was questionable, and that the boy I had grown up with might not be the person I had always believed him to be. I shook my head, trying to push away the rising nausea. "There has to be some mistake." Julia sighed, her expression softening slightly. "I wish there were," she said, then hesitated before reaching into her bag and pulling out a thin manila folder. "But there's more, and I think you need to see it." I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to shut the folder, to walk away and pretend I had never gone down this path in the first place, but I couldn't. My hands moved before my mind could catch up, opening the folder with slow, reluctant fingers, my eyes scanning the grainy photocopy of an old newspaper article. Missing child from St. Mary's Hospital presumed kidnapped. It read, the bold headline stark against the faded print. I barely registered Julia's voice as she continued. This article is from the year Ethan would have been about 5, she said. A child matching his description went missing from a hospital 100 miles from here. Never found. No leads. Case went cold after 3 years. The police assumed he had either been taken by a non-custodial parent or sold into trafficking, but there was never enough evidence to confirm either theory. My breath caught, my fingers trembling as I traced the blurred photo at the center of the page. The child was young, barely more than a toddler, with wide, dark eyes and a solemn expression. Something about him felt familiar, something in the set of his mouth, the way his tiny hands curled into fists at his sides. I knew this child. I had known him my whole life. I slammed the folder shut, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I had to confront my mother. I didn't wait, didn't think, barely remembered getting into my car, the drive home a blur of streetlights and pavement and the deafening roar of my own thoughts. By the time I stepped into the house, my hands were shaking, the folder clutched tightly in my grip, my vision tunneled on the woman who had raised me, who had looked me in the eye time and time again and lied straight to my face. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes as if nothing had happened, as if the entire foundation of my world hadn't just crumbled beneath me. My father was nowhere to be seen, but that hardly mattered now. I threw the folder onto the counter between us, the impact making her flinch, water splashing from the sink as she turned toward me, her face paling at the sight of the papers. "Tell me the truth," I said, my voice hoarse, my throat raw from holding back the scream threatening to tear free. "Tell me who he really is." Her hands trembled as she reached for the folder, but stopped short, as if touching it would make everything inside real, as if acknowledging the truth would shatter the carefully constructed lie she had spent decades maintaining. Finally, after a long, heavy silence, she exhaled shakily and met my gaze, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name, regret, fear, something deeper, something ancient. "He's not our son," she whispered, and in that moment, my entire world collapsed. I had spent my whole life believing my family was whole, that despite our fractures and our faults, we were bound by blood. But now, staring at the woman who had raised me, I realized I had been wrong. Everything I had known was a lie. And if my parents had lied about Ethan, what else had they lied about? The moment my mother's words left her lips, the truth settled into my chest like a lead weight, suffocating and absolute, pressing down on my ribs with an unbearable force. "He's not our son." The words echoed in my head, repeating over and over like a mantra, like a curse, like something I had been waiting my whole life to hear, but had never dared to say out loud. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to shake her until she finally gave me the rest of the truth, the part she was still keeping from me, but instead, I just stood there, my fingers gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel my mother watching me, waiting for me to say something, to ask the questions she had already decided she wouldn't answer, but I couldn't bring myself to speak, not yet. My mind was moving too fast, cycling through memory after memory, searching for something, anything, that would have hinted at this, that would have warned me. That would have given me even the slightest indication that my entire life had been built on a foundation of carefully crafted deception. But I found nothing, only shadows of suspicion I had long ignored, only questions I had never thought to ask. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I swallowed past the lump in my throat and forced myself to meet her eyes. "If he's not our son," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "then who is he?" My mother's hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the folder I had thrown onto the counter, her fingertips barely grazing the worn paper before she pulled back, as if touching it would make it real. As if acknowledging the truth out loud would shatter the carefully constructed narrative she and my father had spent decades protecting. I could see the hesitation in her face, the war waging behind her eyes, the deep, suffocating fear she was barely keeping at bay. And for the first time in my life, I realized something that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. She wasn't just afraid of telling me the truth. She was afraid of what would happen once I knew it. I turned away before she could try to stop me, my legs carrying me through the house without conscious thought, my pulse roaring in my ears as I moved toward the one person who might finally give me the answers I needed. Ethan was exactly where I expected him to be, slouched on the couch in the living room, the glow of his phone screen casting sharp shadows across his face, his expression blank, his posture loose in a way that screamed forced nonchalance. He knew I was coming before I even said a word, his fingers tightening around the phone, his shoulders tensing just slightly, just enough to tell me he wasn't nearly as calm as he wanted me to believe. I didn't waste time with pleasantries, didn't give him a chance to play dumb, didn't let him try to deflect like he always did. Instead, I stepped forward, my voice sharp and demanding, leaving no room for evasion. "Who are you?" Ethan's entire body stiffened, his lips parting slightly, his eyes darting toward the hallway where our mother still lingered, her presence a silent threat, a ghost hovering just out of reach. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his throat working around words he clearly didn't know how to say. And for the first time in my life, I saw something in his expression that I had never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. He wasn't confused. He wasn't angry. He was terrified. The realization sent a chill down my spine, an unsettling weight settling in my stomach like a stone. If he didn't know what I was talking about, if this was all some massive misunderstanding, he would have laughed, rolled his eyes, made some sarcastic remark about how I was being dramatic, about how I was always trying to turn everything into a conspiracy. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at me like he had just been backed into a corner, like he was desperately searching for a way out, like he knew exactly what I was asking but couldn't bring himself to answer. I took another step forward, closing the distance between us, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Tell me the truth," I said, my voice quieter now, more dangerous. "Because I swear to God, if you lie to me right now, I will find out on my own." Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze flicking back to my mother one last time, searching for something, guidance, reassurance, permission, but she remained silent, her face unreadable, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a truth she had carried for far too long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled slowly, his hands shaking slightly as he rubbed them over his face. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I am." It was the first honest thing he had ever said to me. I left the house before either of them could try to stop me, my thoughts spiraling into a tangled mess of confusion and rage and disbelief. My hands were shaking as I climbed into my car, my pulse pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own breathing. I needed answers, real answers, not half-truths and broken confessions. I didn't stop driving until I reached my father's office, the place where he kept the things he didn't want anyone else to see, the place where he locked away the parts of his life that didn't fit neatly into the version of reality he had crafted for himself. It took less than an hour to find it, buried at the bottom of an old filing cabinet, tucked away beneath decades of tax returns and meaningless paperwork. A letter. A single, yellowed letter, addressed to my parents, written in shaky, desperate handwriting, signed by someone I had never heard of before. "Thank you for taking him in," it read. I didn't have a choice. My stomach twisted as I read the words again, my fingers gripping the paper so tightly the edges crumpled beneath my touch. This wasn't just a case of a missing child. Ethan hadn't been kidnapped. He had been sold. I found her the next day, the woman who had written the letter, the woman who had given him away, the woman who had sealed our fates before I was even born. Her voice was hollow as she told me the rest of the story, her eyes sunken with years of regret. My real brother had died as a baby. My parents couldn't accept it, so they bought another one. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember how I got there. But when I walked through the front door, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, and my father was gone. And so was all the money. The house was quieter than I had ever heard it before, the absence of my father's heavy presence stretching through the empty spaces like a ghost, lingering in the corners, hovering over my mother's hunched figure at the kitchen table. The realization that he was gone, truly gone, with no intention of coming back, settled over me with a kind of numb inevitability, as if I had always known this would happen, as if some part of me had been waiting for it all along. But knowing didn't soften the blow, didn't make it any easier to accept, didn't make the truth of it any less brutal. My father had left. He had walked away from everything, from the mess he had created, from the family he had destroyed, from the lies he had spent years crafting, and he had taken every last dollar with him. My mother's hands trembled as she clutched at the fabric of her sweater, her breath uneven, her face drawn in a way that made her look so much older than she had just days ago. Her eyes flickered up to meet mine, red-rimmed and pleading, but I felt nothing but cold detachment as I watched her crumble in front of me, the weight of her own secrets finally dragging her under. She had spent my entire life protecting this lie, feeding it, nurturing it, making sure it never unraveled, but now that it was all out in the open, now that the foundation had been ripped apart, she had nothing left to hold onto. And neither did I. He took everything, she whispered, her voice raw, her fingers twisting together as though she could physically hold herself together if she just clenched her hands tightly enough. The accounts are empty. The savings, the investments, everything, he drained them all. I stared at her, unmoving, unfeeling, my mind already racing ahead to what needed to happen next, to what I needed to do to make sure neither of them ever had the chance to manipulate me again. My father had stolen my money, had bled the accounts dry in a final act of cowardice, had left without a word, without a trace, without an ounce of remorse for the destruction he had left in his wake. And my mother, sitting there, fragile and broken, was just as guilty as he was, not because she had left, but because she had stayed, because she had helped weave the lie that had stolen my childhood, because she had looked me in the eyes, day after day, and chosen to protect their deception instead of protecting me. Tears slipped down her face as she shook her head, her breath catching on a sob she tried to swallow. "We didn't know what else to do," she murmured, her voice barely audible, as if she wasn't speaking to me but to herself, as if she were trying to make herself believe it. "When we lost him, when we lost our real son, we couldn't accept it, we couldn't live with it. Your father, he couldn't handle the grief, and I just wanted to fix it, I wanted to make it better." I clenched my jaw, my nails digging into my palms, every muscle in my body tightening against the urge to scream. "So you bought a child," I said, the words sharp and bitter, tasting like acid in my mouth. "You replaced him like he was a broken piece of furniture, like he was something you could just swap out and pretend was the same." My mother flinched, her lips trembling as she shook her head again, as though denying it would make it less true. "We loved him," she insisted, her voice shaking. "He became ours, he was ours, we raised him. I let out a cold, humorless laugh, cutting her off before she could spin another excuse, another desperate justification. "You didn't love him," I snapped, my hands shaking with barely contained fury. "You loved the idea of what he could be. You loved what he let you pretend. But you never loved him, you never even saw him for who he actually was." The silence that followed was deafening, stretching between us like an open wound, raw and bleeding and impossible to ignore. My mother looked away first, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel a single ounce of sympathy for her. I turned away, already pulling my phone from my pocket, already calculating the next steps in my mind. The first call was to the lawyer I had been consulting in secret since the moment I hired the private investigator, the one who had already been gathering the necessary documents to freeze whatever assets my father hadn't managed to touch. The second call was to the rest of the family, the aunts, the uncles, the distant relatives who had spent years blindly accepting the version of reality my parents had so carefully constructed. They deserved to know the truth, all of it, every twisted, horrifying detail. And I was going to make sure they heard it from me. By the time I found Ethan, He was sitting on the back porch, his legs pulled up to his chest, his face buried in his hands. He didn't look up when I stepped outside, didn't acknowledge me at all until I sat down beside him, the wooden boards creaking under our combined weight. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were red, his face pale, his usual mask of indifference shattered beyond repair. "I always knew something was off," he said, his voice hollow, his fingers twitching against his knees. I never wanted to know. I never wanted to ask." I studied him for a long moment, trying to decide if I believed him, trying to determine if he was just another part of the lie or if he had been just as much a victim as I had. Maybe he had. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe the truth was somewhere in between, tangled in the years of deception, impossible to fully unravel. "They told me I had to fix your messes," I said, my voice quiet, steady, certain. "But the real mess was theirs." I stood, brushing the dust from my hands, stepping away from the house that had once been home but now felt like nothing more than a tomb filled with ghosts. And I just burned it to the ground. I walked away without looking back, without hesitating, without letting myself wonder if I would regret this later. Because I wouldn't. Because there was nothing left for me here. Because some things weren't meant to be fixed. But as I reached my car, as I placed my hand against the door, I hesitated just for a moment, my mind circling back to Ethan, to the look on his face, to the way he had refused to meet my eyes when he spoke. Was he really the victim in all of this? Or had he known more than he ever let on?